In the early 20th century, British colonizers in India confronted a serious problem. Cobras were slithering through the streets, even peacefully inhabiting the homes of the native population. You can imagine the austere British redcoats becoming very startled as they encountered these lethal pests in the crowded streets of Delhi. To reduce the number of cobras, the British started offering a bounty for cobra tails. Soon enough, the cobra population began to fall as the natives began to hunt cobras in return for a nice payday. The plan seemed ingenious. But it didn't take long for the number of tails being redeemed for payment to grow quite suspiciously large. Were there really that many cobras in Delhi? And why did it seem like they were hardly making a dent in the snake population? What was going on? The British soon discovered that some locals had turned entrepreneurial. Cobra farms had popped up all around the outskirts of Delhi. Unlike the British, the natives weren't really spooked by the snakes, and natives were breeding them in large numbers, severing their tails, and then redeeming them for payment. Upon this finding, the British immediately disbanded the reward system. Now out of business, the breeders released their cobras back into the wild. Delhi's serpent population ballooned. The whole venture was a massive failure. Instead of reducing the cobra population, the British colonizers had managed to increase it. I wish I could tell you that this only happened once, but we know plenty of similar tales, no pun intended, which illustrate the same dynamics. For example, historian Michael Vann documents an episode that occurred in 1902. In the wake of the new germ theory of disease, the French colonizers of Vietnam began a campaign to eradicate Hanoi's large sewer rat population. Vann's archival work shows that even though this campaign killed over 20,000 rats a day, the plan failed to substantially diminish the rat population. So, the French government instituted a bounty on, you guessed it, rat tails. Before long, locals, let's call them entrepreneurs, started rat breeding farms throughout Hanoi. Government officials put two and two together when they observed tailless rats roaming the streets. The French disbanded their program, and the rat farmers released their now worthless animals back into the city, significantly increasing the rat population's size. These stories illustrate a fundamental economic principle. The best, noblest intentions in the world aren't enough to guarantee good outcomes. Despite what's commonly believed, it's not merely a lack of political will that keeps people from achieving their goals. Many times, it's something far more fundamental. What is this fundamental reality that scuttles the best laid plans of mice and men? Well, you have to understand that virtually all public policies alter the relationship between costs and benefits. When the benefits of an action change relative to an action's opportunity cost, people's actions also change. And when people change their actions, they may do so in a way that works at cross purposes with a public policy's noble aims. Of course, if the British had intended to increase the cobra population, their policy would have been a resounding success. But alas, their goal was just the opposite. Today's lesson will help you avoid the pitfall that Nobel Prize winning economist Douglas North and his co-authors refer to in their book, Economics of Public Issues. They write, "There is a saying among economists that politicians believe all demand curves and supply curves are perfectly inelastic." That's economic ease, but the meaning is easy enough to grasp. Here's my translation. Politicians often behave as if buyers will be unresponsive when a policy changes the relationship between the costs and the benefits buyers face. Similarly, politicians also act as if sellers will be unresponsive to changes in the costs and benefits that they face. Of course, you already know that's not true. A few moments' reflection on your own behavior will show you that when the cost of some activity rises relative to its benefits, you do less of that thing. Picture yourself at the grocery store buying meat. If you find out that the price is double of what you expected, how much will you buy? Probably less than you originally planned, or maybe even none at all. Here's another example pertaining to buyers. The 1991 luxury tax on yachts caused the wealthy in the United States to cut back on their yacht buying. That's costs changing relative to benefits. In fact, the tax changed the behavior of the wealthy to such an extent that the government paid more in unemployment benefits to former yacht workers than it collected in tax revenue. Conversely, when the benefits of an activity rise relative to its costs, you do more of the activity. For example, we observe that when the wages associated with white-collar jobs rise relative to blue-collar jobs, more people go to college. That's just benefits rising relative to costs. Understanding the examples in today's lesson is easy. It only requires you look through that opportunity cost lens that we've been discussing, because that will focus your attention on how opportunity costs are changing relative to benefits. These examples will illustrate that good intentions can backfire if your policy alters the relationship between the benefits and the costs people face. You can get that Cobra effect, that thing that we saw at the beginning of today's lesson, all over again, and sometimes with deadly consequences. Here's my first example. On July 19th, 1989, United Airlines Flight 232 was flying from Denver to Chicago. It never made its destination. Instead, it crash landed in Sioux City, Iowa, after one of its engines failed. Astonishing video footage shows the plane somersaulting down the runway amidst balls of flame. Of the 296 passengers on board, 112 perished, including 2 infants. In the wake of this horrific accident, 2 Republican representatives, Jim Lightfoot of Iowa and Kit Bond of Missouri, proposed new legislation. Their law would have required that infants and toddlers be strapped into a safety seat on airplanes. Why? Well, on Flight 232, the 2 infants who tragically lost their lives, they did so because they were sitting on their mother's laps. During the turbulent landing, they became loose and suffered severe head trauma. Lightfoot and Bond's well-intentioned legislation would prevent this outcome by strapping a child safely into a seat. The National Transportation Safety Board and the Los Angeles Area Child Passenger Safety Association, wow, that was a mouthful, they both threw their support behind the Lightfoot Bond proposal. James Kolstad, chairman of the National Transportation Safety Board, proclaimed that the economic cost of the extra passenger seat is a very small price for preventing injuries and saving lives. But did you catch the word Kolstad used? Cost. The Lightfoot Bond legislation, were it to be passed, would raise air travel costs relative to air travel benefits. The law means that travelers with infants must give up more now to travel by air. Why must they give up more? Because the law would force parents to purchase an additional seat on the plane for their infant child. Now, why does it even matter? Can you think of how this legislation could lead to more instead of fewer infant fatalities? Well, when the opportunity cost of an action rises relative to the benefits, some people will begin searching for substitute means of achieving their goals. In this case, driving a car is the most common substitute for flying. Lightfoot had argued that, quote, the potential for injury in an aircraft flying at 550 miles per hour is much greater than the potential for injury in an automobile traveling at 50 miles per hour. Of course, that's true, if you only consider speed and ignore the frequency of accidents. When we consider the risk of actually getting in an accident, the picture changes completely. You probably know this, cars are much more accident-prone than planes. In the US during the 1980s, for every single mile you traveled in a car instead of a plane, you were about 35 times more likely to die. Meanwhile, a Federal Aviation Administration study showed that mandatory infant safety seats could have prevented at most one death between the 10-year period of 1978 and 1988. In stark contrast, almost 1,200 children under age 5 died in U.S. auto accidents in 1988 alone. The FAA further calculated that children's mandatory safety seats would increase the average cost of air travel by at least 21% for a family of 4. Of course, we can't know how many travelers that cost increase would send to the roads, but we know it would send some, since the costs of flying, they would have risen relative to the benefits. That's just our principle we've been hammering home here. People's actions change when costs change relative to benefits. Now, for their part, the FAA estimated the Lightfoot bond proposal would reduce the number of infants flying in the U.S. by about 700,000 annually. From the perspective of infant safety, here's the good news. The Lightfoot bond proposal never passed, and its failure to pass certainly saved lives. I make that claim with confidence because we do have good empirical evidence about what happens when flying becomes more costly. The 9/11 attacks, those attacks that I mentioned in the first lecture of this series, they raised the cost of flying by increasing the time people spent waiting in airport security. There's an opportunity cost of waiting in line. Economists Garrick Blaylock, Vrinda Kadiali, and Daniel Simon estimate that due to these increased costs of flying post 9/11, 327 additional automobile deaths occurred monthly for the last quarter of 2001. In fact, overall, Blaylock and his co-authors attribute 2,300 additional American deaths to road fatalities that occurred because of the attacks and the subsequent public policy response. We'll never know how much terrorist activity was prevented by the security response to 9/11. But this much is sure, there were certainly other fatalities stemming from that well-intentioned policy response. Returning to the infant seat rule, requiring seatbelts would not have saved lives. Quite the opposite. Making air travel more costly encourages people to use more dangerous substitutes. Once again, we see the lesson. Intentions do not guarantee outcomes. Let me give you another example of a policy that has the best of intentions. Like the legislation we just examined, this policy fails to achieve its stated goal and even worsens outcomes for the very people the policymakers are trying to help. And just like the preceding examples, we observe this result because the policy changes buyers' costs relative to benefits. In the United States, roughly 637,000 people are released from prison every single year. Unsurprisingly, it's often very difficult for these individuals to find a job. This is true even when we compare them to people who have similar education and work experience, but have no criminal record. Those with a rap sheet are, statistically, still more prone to socially destructive behaviors. And those behaviors may damage an employer's bottom line, which makes those with a record riskier hires on average. Now, to aid these disenfranchised job seekers, we could call them, some U.S. jurisdictions have introduced something called ban the box legislation. As of late 2017, 34 U.S. states had at least one jurisdiction with a ban the box law. You might be wondering where this name came from. Well, a ban the box law prevents employers from asking prospective employees about their criminal history until very late in the hiring process. The name comes from the little box on a job application form that would be checked by someone with a criminal record. Ban the box laws prevent employers from including that box on their job application forms. So what's the rationale? Well, proponents of the law reason that if employers can't distinguish between those with records and those without them, then former criminals will receive interview offers more readily. For BTB advocates, that's how we'll abbreviate ban the box. The thinking goes like this. Once an ex-convict gets an interview, he can reveal his ex-convict status, but he also now has a chance to demonstrate his qualifications for the job. But of course, notice something. This policy does nothing to alter the job readiness of former criminals. Employers are still wary of hiring an ex-convict who turns out to be a bad apple. Economists Jennifer Doliak and Benjamin Hansen describe this suspicion in their paper, The Unintended Consequences of Ban the Box: Statistical Discrimination and Employment Outcomes when Criminal Histories are Hidden. Here's what they say. A criminal background is still linked to less preparedness for many jobs. When BTB removes information about a criminal record from job applications, employers may respond by using the remaining observable information to try to guess who ex-offenders are and avoid interviewing them. End quote. Doliak and Hansen uncover empirical evidence that BTB laws do in fact encourage employers to guess who the ex-offenders are. In fact, they find that Hispanic and African American men are less likely to receive interviews after a jurisdiction passes BTB. With fewer interviews, these men also receive fewer job offers. Why? Young, low-skilled, Hispanic, and African American men are statistically more likely to have a criminal record than other U.S. groups. 3 visuals from Doliak and Hansen's paper tell the whole story. Here's the first diagram. Take a look. This chart compares employment for African American men in areas where BTB was passed versus places where it wasn't. The blue line shows the probability of employment in places with BTB, and the red line shows the probability of employment in places without BTB. The vertical red bar represents the date a given BTB law went into effect. Where Ban the Box is imposed, Hispanic and African American male employment plummets relative to jurisdictions without the law. And here's male Hispanic employment. On average, BTB laws reduced employment for African American men by 3.4 percentage points. It reduced employment by 2.3 percentage points for young Hispanic men. And where these populations are less numerous, say in the northeast of the US, the effects have been even more dramatic. Now, take a look at these data. In contrast with what we just saw, there is no statistically discernible influence of BTB on young Caucasian males' employment prospects. This finding really just jumps out to us from the third diagram. So what's going on here? Well, the reality of BTB, these laws, they raise the costs of learning who has a criminal record. It's costly for an employer to pursue a job seeker to the end of the hiring process, only to discover the applicant has a criminal record. So rather than incur those costs associated with searching, some employers go to the next best and lower opportunity cost source of information. Unfortunately, that happens to be a person's racial or demographic characteristics. African American and Hispanic men are more likely to have a criminal record than Caucasian men. As a result, they get interview offers less frequently. Let's step back for a second. BTB has excellent intentions, of course. We want to improve the employment possibilities of those with a criminal past. We want to give them a second chance. Unfortunately, it decreases the likelihood that minorities find employment. Intentions don't guarantee outcomes. I want to conclude with one more sobering example. If I told you that rates of death by electrocution, poor dental hygiene, and blindness are not evenly distributed across the United States, how would you explain these facts? Well, if you're wearing your economic eyeglasses, you'd start by guessing that the opportunity costs of hiring electricians, dentists, and optometrists might differ region to region. And that's precisely the case. But why? Well, in the United States, more than 800 jobs are currently subject to an occupational licensing law. Licensing laws require that would-be sellers must pay fees to the government or pass a battery of government-mandated exams before they can begin operating legally. In many cases, they must pay a fee and pass exams. As a result, licenses tend to reduce the number of sellers operating in a given market. They do this by raising the cost of becoming a seller. Potential sellers must now jump through a series of hoops just to become legal. And of course, unsurprisingly perhaps, some would-be sellers decide that the cost of those hoops is simply prohibitive. They decide they're not going to enter the market at all. They'll do something else instead. And while the stated rationale of licensing laws is always to protect the consumer, it's unclear exactly how a required course in advanced hydrology, which some states require plumbers to pass, does anything other than decrease the supply of plumbers. Do you really need to be a hydrologist to perform that job well? It's also unclear how occupational licensing for psychics, which jurisdictions such as Annapolis, Maryland have, is supposed to protect consumers from charlatans or quacks. When you restrict the supply of something, you raise its price. That's common sense. And when you raise the price of something, some buyers will search for cheaper substitutes. We saw that with the airplane safety seat legislation. If you're looking through the opportunity cost lens, you've probably already guessed the answer to our puzzle. Economists Sidney Carroll and Robert Gaston have empirically demonstrated that states with the most deaths by electrocution, the worst dental hygiene, and the most blindness are also the states with the most strict occupational licensing of electricians, dentists, and optometrists, respectively. What a coincidence. Some homeowners judge the opportunity cost of hiring a professional electrician to be prohibitively high. Tragically, for some of these individuals, a DIY YouTube video is their substitute for an artificially high-priced professional electrician. Notice how our economic eyeglasses enable us to gain a clearer picture of grim statistics like a person being electrocuted with the wires in their home. Without our eyeglasses, all we can see is a fateful accident that we might attribute merely to insufficient caution or perhaps overconfidence in one's skills. Those things may be true, but they're not the full story. However, with our economic eyeglasses, we understand how this accident resulted from the artificially high price for electricians. Think about how perverse that outcome is from the perspective of the politicians who supported the occupational licensing law. Their intention was undoubtedly to prevent unqualified people from messing around with electrical wires. But this law brought about more of the very thing they were seeking to avoid. More unqualified people messing around with wires. Instead of reducing risk of death by electrocution, well-meaning politicians increased it. In a 2004 paper, economist Shirley Zvorny showed that a majority of economists believe consumers would be better off if occupational licensing were simply abolished altogether, even for medical services. I concur. And the reason that belief is so common among economists is due to what I consider the most critical insight in all of economics. After learning today that intentions don't guarantee outcomes, it's time in the next lecture to think about what that most important lesson is.